Hey guys, welcome to the Daily Word Bible Study, a plain and simple book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse study through the entire Bible. We are beginning a new journey through the entire Bible, starting with the book of Matthew as we study the life of Jesus through Matthew as he presents a Jewish Messiah. Now, that said, we concluded in our last study the book of Malachi, which was the end of the Old Testament and also the end of our first journey through the entire Bible. So this is a new start, and we're beginning in Matthew's Gospel. And if you're going to go all the way to Revelation, cycle back to Genesis, and go all the way around. And so my passion, more than anything else, is to teach these kind of Bible studies in a plain and simple way, verse by verse, chapter by chapter, and book by book. So we're going to begin this new journey in Matthew. Matthew was one of Jesus' apostles that he chose. And Jesus had a motley crew of apostles that eventually were his apostles. We'll get into later more definition of an apostle. But Matthew was a tax collector, and tax collectors were hated by the Jews because they were seen as traitors. A tax collector collected the taxes for for the Roman government. Now, in order to kind of understand sort of the setting of the New Testament, let me do something a little different by way of this introduction. I think I can illustrate it here. And this is a prophetic picture that was given to Nebuchadnezzar. You can read about this in Daniel chapter 2. And what this dream showed or revealed was 5 world dominating kingdoms from Nebuchadnezzar times until the second coming of Jesus. Literally, Jesus will come and in this image of this world, this human form, representing these 5 world dominating kingdoms. Up until this time, you've had mighty kingdoms such as the Assyrian Empire, the Egyptian Empire. They were probably in their day the most powerful, but they did not rule the whole earth. These kingdoms ruled the entire planet. And so if you begin with Babylon, which was around 500 BC, a little over 500 BC. So if you start with Jesus, which is AD, and AD doesn't mean after Christ. I think it's the year of our Lord, something like that. But and for us, a time, how we kind of measure time, if you start with the birth of Jesus and you go back. So you go back, and actually Jesus' birth was around, as people would calculate, about 4 to 5 BC in that timeline there. So if you go back and then 500 years, 500 plus years, that's when you would run into this time frame of the Babylon kingdom. So he was called the head of gold. After that was the breast of silver, which is the Persian kingdom. By the way, the Babylon kingdom ruled around 605 BC to 539 BC. And the Persian kingdom ruled around 539 BC to 331 BC. In other words, each one of these kingdoms pretty much conquered the other kingdom. And then the third kingdom, which was the belly the thighs of brass, which was the Grecian kingdom, ruled by Alexander the Great, which from 331 BC to 168 BC. And then the Roman kingdom, which is the legs of iron, came to power in 168 BC, and it ruled until about 476 AD. So I think the Roman kingdom is probably the longest of the kingdoms. Now there is yet a kingdom that is to arise, which is the feet of iron and clay. We'll get into that later. We have studied that, especially in the book of Daniel and some of the other prophetic writings. So where we are in this prophetic timeline would be the legs of iron, the Roman kingdom. Now, some interesting things that happened during this reign. First, you see, if you go back to Babylon, remember, the Jews were exiled. This was by God's decree, the punishment for their incredible sin. They were dispersed in all of the world. And so once they were deported from the land was destroyed. From that time, interesting, is that the nation of Israel has never again been a freestanding nation. They've always been under the rule of some other kingdom. And if you even look at the modern day nation of Israel, and we'll get to more of that in the same term when we get to Matthew 24, obviously. But they exist and stand because of the aid of the Allies, but more on that later. So what you have is the people of Israel, the Israelites were dispersed. Now, 70 years after their exile, during the Persian kingdom, the remnant of the Jews went back to Israel under Cyrus the king. But still, the majority of the Jews were still dispersed throughout all of the land. This is why when you, excuse me, see in Acts chapter 2, with the day of Pentecost, you had Jews from all over the Roman world that made their pilgrimage. It's not a pilgrimage, but the journey back to celebrate Pentecost. So right now we are in the Roman Empire, okay, that reign. And as I said, it started, the rise of the Roman Empire started in 168 BC. Now, there was a couple of things that had happened. And if you remember, when we closed out Malachi, we said that Malachi was one of the last, you can say the last prophetic word for about 500 years, 450 to 500 years. So there was no prophetic voice, as you would see during that period of time. It is also called a dark age. It is also called the intertestament period. During this time, you see the rise of the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and a couple of other groups. So this is what we're going to see as we move through the book of Matthew. Now, Rome, pretty much like all of the other kingdoms, but especially Rome, did not care. Well, they put it like this. They allowed different kingdoms, let's say, to retain their culture, just as long as you know that Rome ruled. So the Pharisees were the puppet authority given over by Rome, so that to keep the Israelites in line, which they had a hard time doing. Okay, Uh, um, and that was something that always irritated Rome about the Jews, that they always had their sense of being as given to them by God. So the as you come to the time of Jesus, which we will get to, when we actually get into the book, um, one of the things that the Jews imposed on, I'm sorry, one of the things that Rome imposed on the Jews, as well as the whole entire kingdom, was this heavy taxation. And they would have different people that would collect the taxes, and the tax collectors were hated, as I said, because they were seen, they were viewed as traitors, because they were unfair. They would overcharge the people. Rome didn't care just as long as they got their taxes. And you had no appeal. You could not, you know, complain. Rome, like, I don't care, that's y'all problem. The tax collectors were also very immoral. They were oftentimes lumped with sinners. Now, the phrase sinners was um, a term for the loose and immoral people. Not just, when we say sinners, we're talking about, we're all born in sin, but, there are different degrees, of course, immorality, where the tax collectors and sinners were at the bottom. They would be those loose people, you know, um, carousing in the daytime, fornicators out in the open. Okay, so that was the uh, um, tax collectors and sinners. So when you would see them saying he eats with tax collectors and sinners, that was the insult, that he was carousing with these, immoral people. Now, it's not necessarily that true that all tax collectors were immoral, but most of them were. So it was strange when Jesus would call, excuse me, Matthew, who was a tax collector. Now, Jesus also had various different people. He had devout Jews, such as Peter, Andrew, James, and John, Nathaniel, or Bartholomew. These were devout Jews. As I said, he had also a zealot. Now, the zealots were the militant. These were the people that were constant, irritant to the Roman government. They never could overthrow the Roman government, but in their minds, they kept trying to. They would get arrested. You'll see this later on with Barabbas, who was a zealot. Actually, dude got caught in murder and stuff. But as it turns out, he ended up getting freed in favor of Jesus. Okay. Um, so uh, he had, again, different various groups, and these were the people that he sent out to preach his gospel. Matthew also, when you look at the four gospels. Now, let me just say this, and I'll probably repeat this throughout our journey through the Bible, but the purpose of this study is a plain and simple study. In other words, I'm not here to I don't get into a scholarly study here. And the reason why I say that is because, one, I'm not a scholar, but the Word of God is written, is given to us by God through revelation, as people such as Matthew, and it is given in such a plain and simple way so that we can read it and understand it, and then complete it, and then do it, obey it. Now, when we talk about the language, and this is where scholarly work comes in at, during this time, during the Roman Empire, the common language of the day was the Greek language. And so what you will find, and you'll see that with Matthew, his gospel is the most Jewish of Gospels. We're going to find more quotes from the Old Testament than any other Gospel. And you're going to see Jesus presented as the Jewish Messiah. Now, so a lot of the Jewish people, those that were certainly devout Jews, they oftentimes would have their they spoke Hebrew, and you can always kind of tell that, like the Apostle Paul, he would say, "I'm a Hebrew of the Hebrew." You know, he spoke Hebrew, and he did all of the Hebrew customs. So you have that. Also Jewish names. So Paul the Apostle, his actual name was Saul, but then they would also have their Roman side. So Paul was kind of the Greek or the Roman side, and then he also would speak Greek. And so you would see this kind of dual kind of how they would fit in the world. So one was Greek that they would speak, and then of course they retained their Jewish heritage. And so out of all the things that's kind of odd about Matthew being a tax collector, his gospel is going to present Jesus, the most Jewish side of Jesus. And so different gospels, as we will see, get into different sides, given different revelations. Now, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they are called the synoptic gospels because much of the gospels is very similar, as well as in terms of how they tell the story. But in each story, you'll see different points brought out, different things that kind of set them apart, even though they are similar in their uh, revelation. So as we get into Matthew, as I said, Matthew is longer because again, there's a lot of Jewishness that's that's packed in his revelation. Okay, um, and so when we come to, for example, Luke's gospel, Luke is written by a Gentile. He's a Gentile, and he presents the Son of Man. And you're going to see that he's not going to spend a lot of time on the Jewish side or the Jewish nature. He is going to quote some, and because Jesus is Jewish, he can't help but write about a Jewish man. But you're going to see that he is not going to focus on some of the points that Matthew focused on from a Jewish perspective. So, for example, the 23rd chapter of Matthew, where Jesus scathing rebuke of the Pharisees, Matthew doesn't spend that much time on it. A couple of paragraphs and he keeps it moving, okay? So, in fact, when we get into the genealogies, let me quickly go there. And when we get into the genealogies, and you see right off, he says, verse 1, the historical record of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So this is his, the genealogies here trace back to Abraham. Okay. Now, when we get to Luke's gospel, he's going to trace Jesus' genealogy back to Adam. Okay. Now, I also want to point one other thing too. Notice he said in verse 1, the historical record of Jesus Christ. And I want you to kind of let that sink in, because this document here, a lot of people will say, those critics, atheists, other people that would try to say that Jesus was not ever verified to exist. Well, this is a historical document. And unless you can produce another document that would refute this, this would be admitted in a court of law because it tells you the genealogy of Jesus. And that's why he says this is the historical record. Okay, now I'll get more into that in the next study, but welcome to our new Through the Bible study beginning in Matthew. All right, guys, don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP, the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought, a comment, add it to the comments section below. All comments are welcome. I'll see you in the next study.